Who's fooling who? Years ago, when I first began to seriously entertain the idea that Christianity might actually be true, I went to our local public library and came across an article that claimed that Jesus never existed, that he wasn't a real historical person, but just a myth made up by the early Christians. Because this person had a PhD behind their name, they appeared to be a scholar who knew what they were talking about, I had no idea who to believe. Was I being fooled? Just like everybody else that believed in Jesus? Well, it took a little while, but eventually I found out that there is no credible scripture scholar today, none at all, that believes Jesus wasn't a historical person. There's a universal consensus that Jesus actually existed. Whatever else scholars believe about the details of his life, they believe he was a real historical person. In fact, the most prominent skeptical scripture scholar of our day has written a book about this to lay out the overwhelming evidence that Jesus actually existed. He felt compelled to write this book. Bart Ehrman is his name. Bart Ehrman felt compelled to write this book because there's so many people out there, so many scholars that have no expertise in scripture. Their expertise is in some other subject, so they really don't know anything about the historicity of Jesus, or just lay people making bogus claims like on the internet. He felt compelled to write this book to refute all the suggestions people were making that Jesus never actually existed. While it's clear that Ehrman believes that Jesus actually existed, and while he accepts many of the details in the Gospels as being historically reliable, overall, Ehrman doesn't believe the Gospels are reliable. He believes that, kind of like the telephone game, if you've ever played that, or a rumor that's gone wild, that the stories about Jesus in the Gospels are grossly exaggerated. They aren't really historically reliable. And that's especially true, Ehrman claims, when it comes to many of the central claims of Christian faith. For example, Ehrman doesn't believe that Jesus presented himself as the divine Son of God who came to die on a cross in order to save us. Because Ehrman is so prominent, he teaches in a major university and influences hundreds of students every single year. And more importantly, he's written all kinds of best-selling books promoting these ideas. Because he's so prominent, he's convinced many Christians, many former Christians, that they've been fooled, that what they've been told about the Gospels being reliable just isn't true. However, scripture scholarship over the past 25 years, which for the previous 100 or 150 was very skeptical about the Gospels, thought they were unreliable, for the past 25 years has completely shifted directions. Modern scripture scholarship is starting to reach a consensus where they are vindicating the historical reliability of the Gospels, and especially with many of the central claims of Christian faith, especially how Jesus presented himself, what he thought he was up to. I don't have time to go into all the arguments for this, but I can give you one quick example. In Mark chapter 12, Jesus tells this very weird parable. He talks about a vineyard owner who goes on a trip. So he leases out his vineyard to these tenant farmers. When harvest time comes, the vineyard owner begins sending servants to them to get his share of the harvest. The first servants he sends, they beat up. Eventually, they start killing the servants he sends, but he keeps sending more servants. Finally, he decides that he will send, and this is key in how Jesus tells the parable, he's going to send his one and only beloved son to them, thinking that they will respect his son. They have to respect my son. But what do the tenant farmers do? They think to themselves, well, if we kill the son, then we'll get his share of the inheritance. It's an odd logic, but they think that they'll get his inheritance if they kill him. So they beat and kill him. And in the most shameful way possible in the first century Mediterranean world, they just cast his body outside of the vineyard in the open field. There are some really weird details to this story, like the fact that the vineyard owner would just keep sending servants and then eventually his own beloved son after the tenant farmers keep beating them and then killing them, as if they would change their behavior somehow magically. And the tenant farmers believing that by killing the beloved son of the father then would turn around and give them his share of the inheritance. Those details, those weird details are there to clue us into the fact that this is not a story about tenant-owner relations. This is a story about God and his people. It's a story about salvation history. The weirdest detail of all in this story is how it ends. It ends with the shameful death of the beloved son. And that's the clue for scholars that this story had to be told by Jesus. It could be told by no one else. It wasn't told by the later church, invented by the later church. Because if the later church told the story, if they invented it, it would be unthinkable to end it this way. They most certainly would have included some kind of allusion to the resurrection. They would talk about Jesus' glorious vindication after being put to death in such a shameful way. It's so clear in the parable that Jesus is telling a story about himself, that this is a story about God's salvation history and his role in it. But look at what this story also reveals about how Jesus saw himself. It reveals three key things that are central to Christian faith. The first is that Jesus went to his death freely. He's telling this story before he would die on the cross, so he knows he's going to be put to death, and yet he freely goes to death. Secondly, he goes to death in his mind, the climax of salvation history. He is coming at the end of the series of people that God is sending for the sake of our salvation. So he's at the climax of salvation history. And thirdly, and most importantly, he sees himself as the one and only beloved Son. So scholars would say that it's clear, at least in Jesus' mind, that he saw himself as the one who came, the beloved Son, the one and only beloved Son of God the Father, who came to save us by dying on the cross for us. There are many other details scholars have unearthed in the Gospels over the past 20, 25 years that would substantiate and corroborate that this is how Jesus saw himself. They can flesh this out much more. But this one example is sufficient to show that the Gospels, at least in presenting how Jesus saw himself, prove to be very reliable. Who's fooling who? Anybody who would deny the reliability of the Gospels. That's who. So, do you think the Gospels are reliable? I'd love to hear what you think. You can go to the Contact EJ page of the Raising Jesus website and leave your thoughts there. I look forward to hearing from you.